Today we'll be discussing reasons to go into comedy and medicine. And then we'll be discussing reasons to not go into comedy and medicine. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif Doja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment, and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic from medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Today I'll be asking Ali to list his top 5 reasons why someone should pursue a career in comedy.
And then I'll ask Asif to list the top 5 reasons, if he can get to 5, to go into medicine.
And then, to be buzzkills, we will also ask each other the top 5 reasons to not go into our respective professions. Just to be balanced, fair and balanced. That's what we are over here on D versus C.
Were you able to come up with the negatives way quicker than the positives?
You know what? Ali doesn't believe this, and probably people who know me, I'm actually a positive person. I know people definitely don't think that. I think there's 2 types of people in this. I think there's 2 types of people in this world. People who are surface positive, so happy, bubbly, and then deep down they're just like miserable, but they hide that every day. And then there's people who, perhaps like myself, some might say, get annoyed at very superficial things. That person cut me off in driving. Can you believe the price of asparagus these days? But then deep down, I'm actually quite happy with my life and my career. So anyway, that's it. But I want to ask you a question before we get started with this. Ali, this is
really putting the deep in deep down, by the way, Asif, but that's good. No, I know you're happy with your career. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
And your own life too, but just so many. It's really like hanging out with the human version of Peter from Family Guy. Oh, this really grinds my gear. It's constantly gear grinding.
I think it's more like Larry David from
Larry David.
Yeah, so. But I identify with him a lot. But honestly, I am quite happy. But okay, enough psychoanalyzing. So this is going to be more of a conversation between us. I am legitimately curious about what Ali's going to say. We have not discussed this ahead of time. One thing that's very funny is some people who hear indirectly about the podcast, great thing. I heard a story the other day. Someone who I know, one of my daughter's friend's parents, was like, oh yeah, my husband, someone said, oh, you should check out this podcast. So he started listening to Dr. Versus Comedian. He's like, hey, wait a minute, I know that guy. So it wasn't like word of mouth through somebody I know who told him. It was like a complete strange, you know what I mean? Like there was no connection there.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay. Anyway,
I like that. That's how podcasts grow.
That's right.
That's great.
But this woman, when she was telling me about it, she's like, I heard you're a comedian now. And I'm like, well, not really. I mean, I'm the it's Doctor Versus. I'm not the comedian. So I'm just curious, do people ever come up to you, Ali, and be like, oh, I hear you're a doctor now?
That would be hysterical. And I mean, if anybody said that to me, I'd be like, go check yourself in for some help. You're out of your goddamn mind. That's not, if you think that the last time you saw me, I wasn't a doctor and then something happened in my life and now I am a doctor, you're insane. That's crazy. But that's an interesting comment, Asif, and it kind of leads into what we're talking about here today. There are barriers to access in to becoming a doctor. Comedy, very low barriers to entry. And in fact, you could be week to week, you could be not a comedian, and the next week you'd be like, I'm a comedian.
Yeah.
Now, are you a good one? Are you a performing one? Are you one who's celebrated by the world around you? Not necessarily, but you could technically be a comedian.
Yeah, I have to tell people I'm not the funny one in this situation. But so it is interesting. Well, listen, let's get into it. Okay, Ali, so let's get started with this section. So this is our comedy and entertainment section. So I'm asking Ali the reasons why he would suggest someone go into comedy. And then how about we do all your reasons, the positive reasons, right? First, and then we can go into maybe the reasons why you might want to reconsider this. All right, so we
good
go.
news, bad news thing. You want to hear the good first.
And you have five? You have five
I
and
have
five?
five
Or?
of each. I do. I do. I did my
Okay,
work.
good. Okay, good, good. Did the homework.
Um, Number one reason to go into comedy, if you are a creative person, it is a creative world. You're if you're creative, particularly as I think about stand up, you get to go deep into the recesses of your mind, explore your thoughts, dig into the challenge of how to make those funny to an audience, right? Like you have to sort of be creative but also up for a challenge, because often somebody
Mhm.
who's funny with their friends, you can't just take that and put it on stage. And I've witnessed that many times too, where people are like, God, this really killed in my friend's basement the other night. But there's a format, there's a way of presenting it. And I find that to be the exciting part of comedy, taking something that's funny and turning it into stage funny. And it's not always possible. There are times where you're like, oh, God, that really worked in the moment. But sometimes you have to resign yourself to saying, I guess that was a you had to be there kind of moment. But I love that challenge and people who like that. And then the challenge continues to be like, hey, I made them laugh for 5. How do I get to 15 and 20? And then how do I get to 45 minutes? How do I become a headliner? And it's challenging, and it's also, no two crowds are the same, which is an exciting thing. And also, if you're creative and you want to be a creator of comedy online, that's even more exciting. Like there are zero barriers to how
Mhm.
you can present this. If I think about some of my favorite comedy sketches online, some of these guys have gone out and really like bought, spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars on different costumes so that they can do Spider-Man versus Batman or Latino Spider-Man, and do all kinds of like elaborate sketches and pranks. So the comedy world, if you're a creative person, is an incredible outlet. I would say that's the first thing. Number 2 is it's low stakes. I actually like the fact that I'm not responsible for saving somebody's life. It's pretty low stakes. It's comedy,
Mhm.
right? Nobody dies in comedy. This is a saying that some showrunners will have on their wall that, hey, nobody died today and nobody will die in your job. Just keep that in mind. And I
Mhm.
remember sitting with a friend of mine who's a dermatologist in Montreal, and he was telling me this woman came into his clinic and he had to tell her, and this is going back about, I would say 13, 14 years. He had to explain to her that the lesion that she has on her body is probably most likely an HIV related lesion. And HIV had not come along to where it is now. This was over a decade ago, where that was like, you were wondering, is that a death sentence? What does that
Oh
mean?
wow.
And I remember thinking, my God, that's insane. Because in my day today, I spent about an hour trying to figure out what sounds funnier, poop shoot or sphincter. That was my day, versus his day of telling somebody that she might be HIV positive. So if you like that, that's that's good. It's low stakes. There's nobody's going to get hurt, and I don't think I'd like to be in charge of people's lives, making them happy
Mhm.
for a short period of time. That makes me happy as well. That brings me joy. So that's um that's another positive in my books. Number
Yeah, I don't want to be in
3,
charge of people's lives either.
what's that? You don't want to be in charge. Gosh. Number 3, it's an interesting schedule, right? I remember I used to live in Chicago and I was an IT consultant, and I would skip work and I would go to, along the lake on Lake Shore. And I would always be like, who are these people hanging out, playing volleyball at like 11 a.m. on a Wednesday? Who are these people? Now, of course, they could have also very well been bartenders and servers and journalists, and, could have been any number of
Skipping
things. But I
work
was
as
a guy,
well, or
I it could have
perhaps.
been, that's who I was. But I couldn't do it
Mm.
with any regularity. Skipping work was more like a wake up in
Mhm.
the morning and then pretend to be like, my cough, it's so bad, boss man. Um,
Mhm.
so you get into that world. You get into a world of, real flexibility. No 2 days are the same also, right? And in stand-up comedy, you're in different clubs, you're in different cities. When you start out, you're doing the same routine for people, but it doesn't have to be. As you grow in comedy, there's fantastic, phenomenal comedians. Mike Wilmot. I remember seeing Mike Wilmot. I hosted Thursday, 2 shows Friday, 2 shows Saturday. He did 5 different sets as a headliner.
Wow.
It was insane. And every time he's like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And in my head, I was like, yeah, sure, you don't know what you're going to. He really did know what he's just an incredibly brilliant man who has all this huge repertoire that he can just access in his mind. So yeah, as you get older in comedy, you have this flexibility. Everything is different. And I remember, as far as writing and stand up comedy goes too, you have this flexibility. You have like these contracts, they're short, and then they're over, and then you have some free time before the next contract. Sure, there's stress with that too, but it's interesting work for people who don't want to be tied down to a schedule. I remember
Mm-hmm.
this writer who I really like. His name is Jason Reynolds. I think he's in Maryland. And Jason Reynolds was saying he writes every single day, and then every single day he watches a movie. He'll either go to a movie or he would like download a movie, kind of like what Asif does for a living. But his movie, it was his reward, but in a way, he turns off his brain to watch a movie. But in a way, he's like, I'm well aware that my reward is also a type of work because characters
Right.
have plot. Movies have characters and plots and development and all that kind of stuff. So you can't do that in so many jobs. So you can find in this world of comedy some interesting stuff for you to do and some fulfilling stuff to do, not only in your job, but outside your job too. So your schedule is very interesting and allows for that. Number
Mm-hmm.
4, minimal management. I don't really like
Mm-hmm.
being told what to do. I've never been that. I think I used to have a joke on stage about this, that I hate being told what to do so much that even when I'm looking at a to-do list that I've written for myself, I'm like, you don't tell me what to do, to-do list. No, I wrote it for myself. So in stand-up, the stage is great for this. Obviously, you just write what you want. You talk about what you want. And on, when I think about some of these YouTubers, you scout, you location scout, you film,
Mm-hmm.
you do like sort of guerrilla style, get friends to do whatever sketch with you, you edit yourself, you post it yourself. No one tells you anything. So if you like not being told what to do very much, you don't want to have a boss, that can be very interesting. And then in the world of like comedy writing, you have a boss, but typically for a short period of time. So if they're a great boss,
Mm-hmm.
it's a great stint. If this is not a great boss, you can always say, well, this will be done in 2.5 months, and then I can move on to a different, management
Mm-hmm.
style. Yeah. The final thing, number 5, is that it's not in my mind anyway, it's not a dead end job, right? It can be an avenue into many other creative worlds. It reminds me of like people say, accounting. This is obviously the propaganda that I filled my older daughter with in her mind. Accounting doesn't have to stop at accounting. Accounting, when you do accounting, the structure, the skeleton of a business, and accountants make great everything else, right? You're an accountant, you
Mm-hmm.
make a great whatever. I don't know any of the other positions in the corporate
CFO.
world, but CFO, COO, CTO, maybe even tech officer, maybe I don't know.
Okay.
But accountants really understand business. I feel like when you do stand up, you really understand joke writing, joke structure, what it takes to make people laugh. Unless you have a very unique original style, but that's still you. And you from that you can get into writing, you can get into performing, longer things on stage. You can get into theater, directing, producing, and if you if you espouse if you connect with this idea that those bosses, those managers, the ones who started in the mailroom and they worked their way up, if those are the greatest bosses because they understand every aspect of a business,
Mm-hmm.
I think comedy can be an avenue to bigger and better things, and it's a great launching pad as well. It can be also a means, not a means to an end. It can just be in and of itself stand up for the rest of your life, for performing whatever it is online or offline. But it can be an avenue to greater creative worlds. So that is the list. So these are the
Hmm.
5 reasons to get into stand up. It is creative, low stakes,
Hmm.
interesting schedule, minimal management, and it can be an avenue to greater and bigger things.
Okay, so Ali, that was the top reasons to go into comedy. But as we said at the intro to the show, we're all about the positive and negative. So can you tell us your reasons to not go into comedy?
Yes, one of us is much more negative than the other, but yeah. So it's kind of
Mhm.
like a flip. It's kind of like a lot of what was positive can also be a negative. So, for example, one reason to not get into comedy is the minimal management. That's a great thing for some people, but it's also like, people start with like, I can drink on the job. That's amazing. That's actually not a good thing. When there is somebody telling you what to do, yeah, it
Hmm.
can be a massive drag all of a sudden, right? Because you're not used to having anybody tell you what to do, but all of a sudden you got it. There's club owners who have rules, show producers and promoters have rules, and
Hmm.
as a CBC guy, we have this all the time where it's like, listen, you can't say these words on radio. Please don't mention Hitler. Those are typically not funny, and even if they are, it's lost on a lot of people because they're listening in their radio and they just hear Hitler, and
Hmm.
then it's
Hmm.
like bad news. And so we've had like comedians who, the punchline is a reference to women's breasts, a word you can't say on radio, and we're like, oh well, I guess that entire 4-minute joke is dead now. There's no we can't have the ending, so we can't have the joke, right?
Hmm.
And the challenge there is a lot of people who are into comedy are not rule followers by nature. And I know that there's a few YouTubers that I know of who have TV shows now, and the production companies want them because they have all these followers. But then the YouTubers are like, hey, my life was like scout a location on my own, record, get people there, edit, all on my own, and then I made money. So what's with all these like union rules and casting procedures and
Hmm.
this editing and release and product? So you have to know yourself well to know how you operate with management. So if you do not want any management, the comedy world could be a bit of a challenge for you. Also, I had said it's an interesting schedule
Hmm.
in the reasons to get into it, but that interesting can become interesting in quotes.
Hmm.
What I mean by that is stand-up comedy in particular can be pretty lonely on the road. If you're booking yourself, you can see some of your contacts dry up. These clubs just we can turn hands. They get bought out by different people, and yes, somebody who used to believe in you isn't around anymore, or they're just not obliged to give you work when they used to. And if you're a writer in the comedy world, sometimes you're only it's a great schedule because you're working for 3-4 months and then you're free for a while, but then you also don't have a paycheck, and
Hmm.
for those 3-4 months, great paycheck potentially, although much worse, which is part of the reason that strike is happening. But your schedule is not your own. So there's no like, I'm going to go to the gym every morning, I'm intermittent fasting and this kind of stuff. If you like routine, I find it difficult to make a living in comedy if you're somebody who craves routine.
Can I ask you just a follow up with that? With regards to what about the actual hours? So when you're up at nighttime, right? It could be a late comedy show. Does that
Yeah.
drain you after a while? Like for me, being on call, if I get called in the middle of the night, it's a lot more like I'm tired for the rest of the week if it's just one night. Whereas before, I could bounce back when I was younger. But as you get older, right?
Right. When you start out in comedy, particularly if you're in your 20s and 30s, that's just your life. You're staying up late. It's a rare thing to be home before midnight. And typically, it's somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m. you get home, but you get your rest because you sleep in a fair amount. Now, if you have a partner who is like pretty active in the mornings, these things can be a drain on the relationship. Like, oh man, I left the house and you were sleeping. I come back, you're not here, and then you come back late. This is why a lot of people were like, how always asking me, how do you do it? How do you and your wife manage this comedy thing? And I was like, no, it's not a hobby. It's my life. She
Right.
married a comedian. This is my job. It's no like, how do you manage? She knew she was getting married to this person, but for people who get into it late in life and they're already in a marriage or a relationship and then they get into it, I see that be a struggle for a lot of people. And specifically because of the schedule, and your partner is on but you're wiped out because you've had a bunch of late nights in a row and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. So they do say it's a single person's game sometimes. I'm not sure if that's
Yikes.
true. I feel happy about what I've done as a married person, but yeah, because of what you're talking about, energy wise, it helps to be young and single, I think. You also have to, this is the third thing here, take a lot of garbage from people. You're not really in control of, um, you've got this schedule that's already kind of loosey goosey. And then you sometimes you're like, okay, I'm going to go up at 10 o'clock tonight, but then you go 10 and you get bumped from the show because the person like, sorry, this bigger comedian came in or his friend of mine came in. So you get bumped. And Maz Jobrani, who we've had on this show as a guest, he was telling me a story once about sometimes it would be midnight and there's like three audience members left and you just keep getting bumped and bumped because you're a new comic and nobody knows you or cares about you. And then finally it's time to go on. It's like hardly anybody there. And Maz was like, I didn't care. I had like these jokes that I wanted to get out and I wanted to get on stage. And I viewed it as a challenge. Let me try to entertain these three people who are still here. But he said, but there were a lot of people who were there with him at the time. And they were like, this is nonsense. This is complete crap. I'm not putting up with this. And they were gone. And he said, a lot of them were funnier than he was. But it's not just about being funny. It's also about like being able to withstand these type
Mm-hmm.
of,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, crappy
Mm-hmm.
situations.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
censor myself. I said crappy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Fourth is, I was saying that it's when I was talking about the good stuff, I mentioned it's low stakes, but then that can be a bad thing too. It's low stakes. You're not saving lives and you're not really changing the world. Even if you're the greatest stand up of all time in this day and age, people are moving on quickly to the next things. Like right now, there's a guy named Matt Rife who's huge on Instagram. He's having a phenomenal moment. But let's talk in 2 years. He may or may not be in comedy. People move on to what's next. There's no loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't require any loyalty from your fans or from viewers or listeners, right? So that kind of low stakes is you're not having a tremendous impact on the world around you. So that might not be for everybody. And finally, why you don't go into comedy potentially is this prevailing notion that comedy owes you nothing,
Hmm.
right? If you're an entitled person who is like, you know, I'm doing comedy, so therefore I should get this, and I've been doing more stages than that person, and I've had my jokes are funnier than theirs, so why am I not getting this? Don't get into this business, right? Just because you put in the work doesn't mean you get the
Hmm.
reward. Comedy owes you nothing, and that is the simplest, best advice I can give anybody. Like, you have to be ready to see people who are less seasoned than you, potentially less funny than you in your own eyes, um, get like win a $25,000 prize on a competition or something, and you have to watch that throughout your entire career.
Mm-hmm.
They advance here, they get headline before you, they get a TV show, they get stand up on television, all kinds of stuff. And you really have to be a little bit zen about it and be like, that's okay. If they didn't get it, it wasn't like I was number two in line, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
they didn't steal a job from me. Everybody has their moment.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually,
Hmm.
maybe I'll have mine, but you have to enjoy the journey in and of itself and not be focused on the rewards. Otherwise, you're getting into it for the wrong reasons.
This is very interesting. Can I ask you? There's two things you didn't mention, and I thought you were going to mention them, and then you didn't. In the last two things, when you said you had to, take a lot of garbage before when we were offline, you mentioned, eat a lot of garbage. I thought or eat a lot of crap. I thought you meant that literally, like you have to eat like chicken
That's
fingers
hilarious.
and fries and the thing. I thought it was a health thing, and then I thought, oh, but it's also like staying. You're going to do a show. Oh, we got a place for you to stay. You're put up in some like crappy apartment with like roaches and stuff, or everybody talks about sleeping in their car, driving so far to sleep in your car. Have you ever had experiences like that? And is that enough to discourage somebody from going into comedy? You're not making a lot of money at the beginning, right?
You're not making a lot of money for a number of years. And yeah, certainly, sometimes the word comedy condo is a huge misnomer. You're like, oh, this is not a condo of any kind. This is like a horrible place. And I'm, I don't even want to think about what happened on this couch that I'm sleeping on prior to my arrival here. Yeah, it can be a little bit gross, and it's not the cleanest of environments that you're in often, and also not the healthiest from a drinking standpoint, drug standpoint, or food standpoint. So all those for me fall into when I was talking about your schedule.
Mm-hmm.
It's great schedule, but the schedule is like,
Right.
is it that interesting? You can't have structure in your life the way you might like, right? And so so for example, there have been times where I've been focused on my health, and the comedy club goes, "Yeah, you get a free meal at the club before your show." And I look at the menu of the club; it's like lasagna, garlic bread, pizza, burgers, and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
that's not what I'm trying to do. That none of that stuff is actually going to help my comedy. That's all stuff that is delicious, but slows me right down
Yeah,
if I'm
yeah,
doing a 45-minute set on stage.
yeah.
So then you are all of a sudden like, yeah, you have to go spend $15-20 on a dinner somewhere. And the club was like, well, that's your problem.
Yeah,
We offered you a free
yeah,
meal. Right. So
yeah,
it's these kind of things you have to be like, that's why there's the good and the bad. On
yeah,
the one hand, it's like, hey, free meals,
yeah,
free drinks.
exactly.
But
Amazing. Yeah.
however, think about what those free meals are and think about where those free drinks get you.
The other thing I thought you were going to say in your last point was about comedy doesn't owe you anything. I thought it was going to be more about how with this PC culture where the pendulum is swinging so PC you can't say anything. I thought I was a bit worried you were going to say you should not go into comedy. It's too much. You're going to be canceled. If you say stuff, the minefield you have to navigate is too much.
Well,
No.
Asif, I'll tell you that, not only does comedy owe you nothing, but my list of reasons to not go into comedy owes you nothing,
Oh
Asif. I'm
no.
sorry my list didn't live up to your standards. Um,
It's
that's a
just a
much more
conversation.
loaded subject. I'm sorry. My list, you know, I could have included that. I think we did an episode about
Yeah, yeah.
that,
We
right?
we've
We've
talked
talked
about it.
about this
Yeah,
at
and we
length,
actually
and
probably should target it more head on in the future. We've kind of like brushed up against this subject, but we should probably talk about it more head on
yeah,
maybe.
I think
Yeah.
it's a huge challenge, but
Yeah.
it's part of the landscape we're in. I'm talking about, do you get into it or not get into it? So these are people who are starting
Yeah.
now. So this is the lay of the land. It's very different for people like myself who started 15
Right.
years ago, 17 years ago. Listening to Russell Peters talk about this at length, a guy who started 30 years ago. I mean, he's watched it really, really change. And while he still will sell out an arena in almost every major city in this country, he has so much more hate and backlash. And he's just like, man, just change the channel. Don't come.
Hmm.
What's so hard about that? And of course, it's a very interesting thing that he said in an interview on CTV recently, that the consequence of us coddling children for the last few decades is that they have no coping mechanisms.
Hmm. Coddled
And that's
adults.
why, what's that?
They're coddled adults.
They're coddled young adults.
Yeah.
So now they're like, I don't like what was just said. So I don't know what to do. And it's like, okay, well, report the bully and like, get other people to like side with you to be like, well, that person said something that offended me. And right, he said, just because you're offended doesn't mean you're right. And that's always been the case. I think that when people are offended, you have to remind them like, oh, well, that's kind of your problem, not our problem as comedians.
Hmm.
But yeah, this lack of coping mechanisms is definitely something we can go on about for quite some time. So to recap my reasons to not go into comedy: minimal management, know thyself. No, know thyself. to thine own self be true.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
If you can't work that way, know that. An interesting schedule that can also be lonely and unstructured and, not steady with the pay. You eat a lot of garbage. You got to do things that, make you feel a little bit demeaned from time to time. Not just like audiences, but also bookers and, and,
Mm-hmm.
and producers. Low stakes. You are not going to change the world. We have talked about that in this podcast in early episodes as well, about how people believed comedy could change the world. If you look at some of the great comedians who have come, out over the decades prior, and how we still had, the Donald Trumps in power and all these other sort of movements, comedy has not helped any of that. And finally, comedy owes you nothing. So if you're a person who can't handle that, you will struggle greatly in the world of comedy. Time to talk about medicine, huh? I
Mm-hmm.
assume you have a list of some kind, Asif?
I do have a
And
list.
it better be up to my standard.
Yeah, I hope you don't have any comments about my list. Yikes. Okay.
Yikes.
So we'll start off the same way you did. We'll start off with reasons to go into medicine. Again, everybody relax. These are my personal beliefs on why I would encourage people to go into medicine. You may disagree. And just
Boo.
hang on, because a lot of these, as Ollie had alluded to in his section, some of these positives have a corresponding negative. And so, you have to balance these things out. So we'll get to the negatives. I'll try and stay with just the positives. So the number one reason, and again, Ali and I have talked about this before on the podcast and offline, the number one reason to go into medicine is if you love the study of medicine and the human body, disease processes, and you are fascinated by that. That's the reason to go into it, because that will be your reward every day. You can't always save everybody. You can't always make people happy. There are frustrations, which I'll get to in the negatives side.
Mm.
But this is it. If you love what you do and you love this figuring out what's going on. So I've mentioned this before for neurology. I consider myself a detective in neurology. That's what we actually are. And sort of like Columbo or who else?
Batman?
Exactly. The Dark Knight Detective. So because you have a list of symptoms that comes up, and then you need to try and figure out what's going on, keeping in mind the individual person in front of you, whether it's a baby, child, or for adult practitioners, adults, and then trying to put that all together to kind of figure out what's going on. And there's an art to that you can Google stuff online, you can use AI. There's still something at this point in medicine where you need to have the expertise, the patient in front of you, and working through this problem solving method. So that's what I really like, but it doesn't have to be that, right? Some people are like, the diagnosis is fine, but that's not what I'm interested in. That's what surgeons are. Surgeons, they do diagnose people, but what they're like, what can we do? What's the next step? The next step is actually doing something. For them, it's surgery. Other people, it's like an oncologist or a radiation oncologist giving chemotherapy or radiation therapy to help try and treat somebody's cancer. There are different ways to kind of look at it. Pain specialists who want to intervene to help with people's pain that they're experiencing. So there's so many ways to do that, and I just think it's a bit more rewarding than you could say, well, Asif, you can do that by just becoming a PhD in some sort of biomedical science, right? I'm just gonna I like that. I want to study the human body. I just find it's more rewarding because of the interaction with other people and the patients and then your colleagues. So for me, the love of the study of medicine, if that is your primary motivating factor, you will never be disappointed in work.
It's a great first one. I think I listened to a basketball player talk about something similar recently. Chris Paul was talking about you have to love the the process, the whole
Mm-hmm.
you have to love practice. You have to love just the game because every single team loses except one in the grand scheme of things. So if you're in there just to win and for the accolades and for the rest of it, right? The glory, it's like you're just going to be so sad so often.
Hmm.
It's so
Hmm.
much better to
Exactly.
be in love with the entire
Process,
process of
yeah,
it.
yeah. And again, we're going to get to some limitations with the process, but the second reason is job security, which seems like a strange thing to be saying about medicine. And there are a couple caveats with this, but in general, you could probably find a job somewhere in medicine if you're a doctor. It may not be where you want to practice. I mean, you may have to leave Canada. Some surgeons, very hard for them to find jobs because there's no operating room availability for them. So sometimes you have to leave the country even, or leave the province, or leave the city that you live in. So you may not be able to get a job where you want to live in, say downtown Toronto, downtown Vancouver. You may not be able to find that, but you probably will be able to get a job somewhere. It may not be ideal. So there is this idea of job security and this idea of being your own boss. You don't some specialties you cannot really be your own boss. Like if you want to be like a pathologist, it might be hard to run a pathology lab on your own independently. But for the most part, if you're a family doctor and you can join a family practice, you can work in a hospital, or you can just say, I'm setting up my shingle. I'm a family doctor. I'm running my own practice. I'm my own boss. And like, as you implied, Ali, there are pros and cons to that. There's expenses, but you have that ability, and I think sometimes that's not appreciated as much when you compare us to other people in other professions where there is no job security, right? And you gave a good example in comedy.
Or people who come from abroad
Hmm.
with medical degrees in hand, and then those are not
Right,
recognized. Those
right.
people hate you right now for saying the
It,
words job
well,
security, but that's
exactly, but well, I mean, there's a couple things. I mean, they also could have probably got a job in the country that they were in. I don't know if they, but there may be other reasons why they had to leave.
I
But
imagine
but
there
you
are.
have a good point. We are very lucky. A Canadian or American medical degree is extremely portable to other places, and the reverse is not always true. So
Hmm.
again, maybe this caveat should be more job security in
Canada.
Canada or high resource countries. But again, I mean, one thing that people are always going to be doing is getting sick, right? That when you think about the overall job security, we're not there yet where nobody's getting sick anymore, right? So
It's
and
pretty grim.
they will need a doctor or healthcare professionals at some point. The third is, again, I'm comparing this to something Ali said before, is actually making a difference, right? A lot of professions, what's the worst thing that's going to happen, right? In ours, somebody could die, and you have to be a bit careful about this making a difference, because a lot of people interpret making a difference with saving a patient or curing a patient, but that's not it. Sometimes you have to deal with patients who have an incurable disease, and I do this all the time, and a lot of my colleagues do, or some of my colleagues are in palliative care. They're easing people into the dying process, and trying to alleviate their symptoms, while they're going to this final destination. So with those, you're not curing them necessarily, and you may not even be healing them, but you are helping people in that respect as well. And that's something that you have to keep in mind when you're doing this. We cannot prevent death in everybody. We cannot prevent suffering sometimes, but we can try and minimize that as much as possible, right? The suffering aspect. And so that's a thing. And then one of my buddies, who's is a very successful business guy, we were talking years ago, and he's like,
Why, thank you, Asif. I do regard myself as a no.
anyway, it's
Not even
somebody
can't even
else.
pretend for a second. Yes.
And he said, he was lamenting. He's like, you know what? I sell X number of, widgets or whatever. He doesn't sell widgets, but I sell
Widgets,
this.
what a contemporary reference,
That's
Asif.
right. That's right. I know in business school they call them widgets when they're talking about a
That
one
was in
specific business.
1993. But anyway, I think
Anyway,
they've guns and butter and widgets. I think that's pretty dated.
is it?
What do I know?
I don't
Yeah, I
I
think
don't
so.
know. I mean, I certainly haven't gone to business school, unlike you. But anyway, my point is like, all we do is sell this, I sell this, I sell this. Like you're actually making a difference. And I think that's important. But again, there's caveats to all this. You have to interpret what making a difference is to you. And sometimes it's just explaining a diagnosis to a family, being there with them through the process with a patient or a family. So that's number three. And the fourth is related to that. It's actually interacting with patients. And I've said this before to Ali privately and on the podcast many times. I love, love, love interacting with patients. Um, and the kids that I see, it's the best part of my job. I love seeing patients, and that hopefully should bring people joy. Yeah. Oh, because some people be rude sometimes. Yeah, of course. That happens in everything, and it's usually, of course, not the kids. That's very uncommon. It's usually the parents, but it's not even usually the parents. It's just a small minority whenever that happens. But again, you empathize with them. They're going through a difficult time. Obviously, their child is sick, so you try and again help them and guide them through it. But the best part of my job is every day seeing patients, and it makes up for the other frustrations that you get. So I hope people who really get something, who go into medicine, really get something out of interacting with patients, or if they don't, perhaps they choose a field which has less patient interaction. So they're getting some of these other things out of medicine, but maybe if they don't really like interacting with patients, say in radiology or pathology, then they've chose something that they don't have to do that as much. I would say for me and most of my colleagues, this interaction with patients is a huge thing.
And we should remind people, in case you're a first time or a newer listener, Asif is a pediatric neurologist.
Right.
That's why he keeps talking about interacting with children. That's not everybody's medical reality,
That's right.
obviously.
That's right. And usually, it's obviously for most adult physicians, it's a one-to-one with the patient, maybe their family as well. But hopefully, people really enjoy that too. And especially these my friends who are family doctors or general pediatricians, family doctors who see people throughout their lifespan. Right? You could see them from kids to adulthood. Maybe if you practice long enough till they're an elderly person. And same thing with pediatricians. See somebody when they're born up until when they turn 18. There is something really good about that. I'm actually getting to the point, Ali. It's going to happen, I think, next year, while I have been practicing for 18 years. So there will
Mm,
be some patients who I saw as a newborn baby in the neonatal intensive care unit who are about to turn 18. I have, I think,
I
one or
love
two
it.
coming up next year. And that's like a big thing for me. It's a huge milestone to see these kids. Like, imagine, right? Like when they were a newborn baby to now they're going off into the world. So pretty exciting
And the
stuff.
hope is that they don't see you, walk over and kick you in the shin,
That,
right?
that
Be like,
that's
you screwed me up, doc.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And the last reason I think to go into medicine is this idea of constant learning. And you never, I think, want to go into a field where you've kind of mastered it or you've mastered 99% of it early on, because I don't know, like there has to be this desire for constant learning. And again, I'm not saying you don't get that in other fields. I'm sure you do, but I would want that for people who want to pursue medicine. They would want to have this quest for knowledge, and especially, I mean, neurology I think, one of the pinnacles of this. Right, there's so much we need to learn with neurology, with regards to genetics, with regards to how the brain works. We still just know such a small amount of this, and every year we learn new things, and it's amazing. The field has changed in so many ways just since I started practicing, which, like I said, is just shy of 18 years ago. So I don't know. I think that idea of constantly learning, and it may be intimidating to some people, but that's another one of the best parts of it is constantly changing, constantly learning. You don't want to, like I said, be an expert, after a couple of years of practicing something, right? So then, Ali, just to recap my reasons for encouraging someone to go into medicine: if you love the study of medicine, human biology, disease; job security, number two; number three, actually making a difference in someone's life, or the patient or the family; and number four, interacting with patients, that one-on-one connection; and then the fifth reason, the idea of constantly learning in your field.
Yeah.
No. Okay.
Big fan. I'm a big fan, obviously. All right, so let's talk about why not to go into medicine. Number one, you're dumb. Huh? I know that stopped me from going in.
Well, let's say reasons like what you might be discouraged from doing it these days. The number one thing is definitely what we call structural limitations, the problems with trying to administer medical care. And I'm going to limit this to North America just because that's my perspective. There are many, many more extreme examples in other countries. When you have places in Africa where your catchment area for a hospital can be 50 million people. It is. And some clinics will see in some countries 1,000 people a day in a clinic. Like these are very extreme resource limitations. So there's that as well. But even just practicing in the U.S. and Canada, and there are different things, but the idea comes down to finite resources and how you distribute those. It's a bit different in Canada. It's because our healthcare system is provincially funded. So, and we need there's people are living longer with diseases. There's newer treatments for diseases. These costs have to go up. And because of that, we need more money in the healthcare system. But when you're a publicly funded healthcare system like we have, like the UK has, there are going to be constraints with that. The US is a slightly different thing because they spend the highest percentage of their GDP per capita on healthcare, but yet they don't rank highest in the quality of healthcare delivered in the world. And what's the reason for that? Well, you have a lot of insurance companies and these and HMOs and these kind of this barrier between patient care and physicians, and the negotiating all that physicians have to do all the time with HMOs and getting coverage for people who don't have insurance, people who have limited insurance. Arguing with insurance companies about doing tests, treatment, etc. For my colleagues in the U.S., that I think is a very that weighs on them a lot, I think, and I think it's certainly a source of frustration at the very least. And so these are things that are difficult, and it is a bit disheartening, I think, to say the least, when we see this need to argue with either governments or insurance companies all the time to advocate for patient care. That is a tough thing, and these limited resources causing for us in Canada long waiting lists. It can be discouraging, and sometimes it makes you think, am I actually making a difference? Right? That's the problem, is it can impinge on some of those reasons to go into medicine. Number two is related, and it's about work-life balance. And again, we've talked about this on the show. We have some episodes on physician burnout from last year, which you guys can check out in our archives. But it's an issue, and so of course this is contributing to the limitations and our dwindling resources from my first point, because if people are leaving the profession, that's going to exacerbate wait lists. We talked with the gritty nurses when they were on our podcast, right, about people leaving the nursing profession, and the problems with that, and them looking for other things and wanting to leave. So then we have a low amount of nurses in the workforce, right? But we need nurses for the healthcare to survive. So this work-life balance is tough. It's hard sometimes for people to turn off. Like it may be easy for people, say, who have some other jobs, to, like, you work 9 to 5, you get home, turn it off. Now you can concentrate on other things. It is tough. Last week I was on call for the full week, and I was still thinking about my patients and checking in with my colleagues to see how they're doing. Did everything kind of go okay? What's the next step? So it's harder to turn it off, and so it bleeds into your home life and your off time, right? The idea about, are people better off in medicine, in terms of a work-life balance? Like, again, I have a lot of friends who work for the government, where they work for the municipal government, the provincial or state government in the US, or the federal government, and a lot of them have the proverbial golden handcuffs, right? But they're talking about retiring in the next 5 to 10 years. And I'm like, oh, that would be nice, nice to do. And then you're like, are they better off? Because I'm not sure about that. So anyway, I think about that
The
sometimes.
answer is yes.
That's right. And the other thing is with regards to family life and this work life balance, and I think there's a whole other aspect of this which I would like to get some other people on the podcast to talk about, which is this idea of women in medicine and how they balance, because there are much more pressures for women in medicine in terms of balancing their home life and work life, versus men. That I think that's just a fact of life, and I see it every day. My wife, as you guys know, is a physician, and so I think that that's a big thing that we need to keep in mind as well. And if and it is a reason to think twice about going into medicine, this idea of work life balance, because the work really does bleed into your home life, unfortunately.
Another reason to really um, dive into number one, the number one reason to go into it, which is loving the
Right.
study of
That's right.
medicine,
That's
right?
right.
That's kind of it's so appropriate that you would give that reason first, because I think it has to be the overarching
Right.
thing.
It goes back to all of this. And so, my third reason to not go into it is again something you have to balance, which is the idea of debt, right? Debt, we know post-secondary education debt can be crippling for some people, but when you're talking about doing an undergrad, doing medical school, coming out with debt, and that's even in Canada, you'll have a significant amount of debt, but in the US, where you can easily come in with $500,000 plus in debt, and that is a huge thing. And the problem with that is it affects all these other things, this work-life balance, because I've met people from the US who, just chatting with them, and they're like, "Oh, I'd love to like kind of scale back and kind of move to a small town and do all, but I can't do that. I need to make money because I have this huge amount of debt hanging over my shoulders." Then you have that debt plus buying a house, which is something that everybody, faces with housing prices going up and inflation. You become handcuffed because of this idea of debt. So you have to really consider that, and how are you going to be able to live with this, because again, is that going to balance out your love of medicine and seeing these patients? I don't know. The other reason, which is similar, is related to money. If you think that you want to go into medicine to make money, I strongly suggest you pick another profession, because again, you'll come out with a large amount of debt, which needs to then be paid off. In most cases, if you're lucky enough to have family that, and generational wealth that pays for that, great, that you're very lucky. But otherwise, you will need to be paying that off. And so even if physicians do make a lot of money, in the grand scheme of things, are they better off than someone who has a government job with a paid pension, which we don't have, and benefits and things like that, which again we don't have. We have to pay for all these things. I don't know. I think you really need to do the economic calculations. Don't get me wrong. I think physicians, they're not going to be poor, but I don't think they're going to be filthy rich, which maybe have been the perception of physicians years ago. The fourth thing is administrative demands. So, one thing that has been noted, again, we talked about this in our burnout episodes, is there is increasing burden of putting things onto physicians, administrative things. So, making sure that tests are ordered in a very specific way. We talked about electronic medical records, and just pushing a lot of this paperwork, for even though it's done electronically often, onto physicians, because often organizations can't find anybody else to do it. They don't want to pay for more administrative assistance, so they download that onto physicians, right? Contrast that with lawyers. My sister-in-law is a very high profile lawyer, and I remember her telling me once, she was talking about photocopying or stuff like that, because I said I had to like photocopy and print some stuff out. She's like, as if I was printing out stuff from a printer, her supervisors or partners would be like, "What are you doing?" This is, again, when she was more junior. Get back to work. Like, you're billing. You should be billing clients and making us money. You shouldn't be photocopying. We have people who do photocopying for you and can do this administrative work. That's not your job. Your job is to do this, but it's very different in medicine. It's like this stuff just keeps getting downloaded more and more to physicians, because again, when you have in the US these HMOs trying to make money, or in Canada, government organizations trying to save money, right, then it's just easier to download this to physicians. And it sounds like I'm complaining a lot, but honestly, it has really increased a lot, this administrative work that is not compensated, right? That's the thing. And so, in other words, we could be seeing patients and could be doing other things, but instead you're doing this paperwork. So it is a bit of a and I agree. Everybody has paperwork to do with their jobs. Honestly, even I'm sure you do, Ali, right? Whether it's your taxes or whatnot, or organization for your show.
Refuse to do it.
That's right. It just piles up. That's a huge pile behind Ali in his study right there. But yeah, so I know everybody has it, but when you think again, what physicians could be doing with their time, again, you use that example for lawyers. Lawyers should be talking with clients, billing, making money for themselves or their organizations. We should be seeing patients, right? But this is being taken away. And the last thing is, again, something that we probably should devote a whole episode to, is this idea of malpractice lawsuits and complaints and how you deal with these. Malpractice lawsuits, more common in the US than in Canada, but there are very, very significant ones in Canada, or perhaps just patient complaints. This idea of patient complaints, dissatisfaction, it doesn't happen uncommonly, and it can be very devastating to people, whether it's a complaint, and sometimes complaints are unfounded, sometimes they're actually very, very legitimate, and sometimes it's due to medical error or negligence, other times it's not, but it can be very draining. And the idea that people could be pulled into a malpractice lawsuit, or sometimes even public complaints, right? If patients and families go to the press, that can be very, very draining. And then it can almost negate all the other stuff that we've talked about in terms of the positive, right? If you have that. And again, you could say, yeah, but if you have 100 patients who are happy with you and one complains, you're obviously going to be much more concerned about that one complaint versus the 99 people who were very happy with the care you provided.
Yep.
But that's just human nature, right? Like, it's you, Ali, when you're in a comedy club, right? That one person who's not laughing. You mentioned this before, right? Like, why are you focusing on them? Why don't you focus on the 99 people who are laughing, right? But
Yep.
obviously it's a different situation, but again, and sometimes they're minor, sometimes they're major, but that can certainly impact people's desire. So those are these 5 reasons that I have there, Ali. So again, to recap: structural limitations and dwindling resources. Number 2, work-life balance. Number 3, debt, and this idea of you won't be as filthy rich if you go into medicine. Administrative demands ever increasing, and then malpractice lawsuits and complaints, reasons to perhaps not go into medicine. But in the end, Ali, would I do anything different with my life? I wouldn't. In life in general, you have to minimize in your work the things that frustrate you, that make you not like going to work. You try and minimize those as much as possible and maximize the things that make you happy. I think this advice is best for people thinking about going to medicine, so they can go into it with a clear head. It's tough if you're listening to this and you're like, oh my God, none of those reasons to go into medicine resonate with me, and all those reasons to not go into medicine resonate with me. Like, I would feel very bad for those people, because again, maybe they're trapped, right, because of this idea of debt and work-life balance.
But you've done them a favor as well, right? That's better to know now,
yeah,
right? See your way out of the trap somehow,
yeah.
rather than 5-10 years into the profession. You're helping people, Asif.
Thanks.
Your negativity is helping.
What?
Yeah. Well,
That's our episode for today. Let us know what you guys thought. A bit of a different episode that Ali and I decided to do. Give a little insight into our perspectives on comedy and medicine. So let us know what you guys thought. drvcomedian@gmail.com, Dr. V Comedian, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We are everywhere. Ali, I just wanted to make sure I pointed out to our listeners that we're going to be taking a month off for the month of August. So a bit of a recharge, reset, make sure Ali and I have time with our families. And then we will be
Our what
back.
now?
We will be back with brand new episodes in the beginning of September. I don't know if we're going to call all the episodes before we had season 1 and that's season 2. I don't know, because season 1 was like a 2.5 year season, so it seems a bit strange to do that. But anyway, I'm not quite sure what we're going to do. But just so you guys are warned, if you don't see new episodes popping into your feed, who knows, if something really newsworthy comes out, we'll we might cover that. But otherwise, expect August.
Asif has a rash. Let's talk about it. Or did you mean in the world around us?
And remember that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. Medical issues we talk about are for your interest and information only, and they're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice, as I will do for my rash. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Recap your 5 things again. I kind of sidetracked you.
Oh yeah, sure. I love that you whisper as though the audience can't hear that part when you whisper. You know, you could just edit it out instead, right? Are they listening?